Welcome back to the Drowsy Historian. Take a moment, before we begin, to settle yourself. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Find a posture that feels comfortable. Let your shoulders fall away from your ears. Soften your jaw. Let the day go. Tonight we are going to travel slowly through the longest continuous civilization the human species has ever produced. 3,000 years of history, 30 dynasties. More than 170 known kings and queens. Pyramids built of limestone the color of bone. Tombs cut into the cliffs of a desert valley. A language written in pictures, carved on stone, painted on plaster, on papyrus, on the inside of coffins. A god of the sun, a god of the underworld, a god of writing, a god of the river. A people whose entire understanding of time, of death, of meaning, was shaped by the slow, patient flooding of a single river. The river was the Nile. The civilization was Egypt. It is a longer story than any other we have followed in these long evenings. Older than Rome, older than Persia, older than Greece. Older even than the cities of Mesopotamia by some measures. Tonight we are going to follow it from the very beginning, in the dim early 3rd millennium before the birth of Christ, through the building of the Great Pyramids, through the long slow centuries of decline and recovery, through the splendor of the New Kingdom, through the foreign conquests and the foreign dynasties, through Alexander and the Ptolemies and Cleopatra, through the Roman absorption and the slow Christianization and the eventual Arab conquest. We will end in the end in a Coptic monastery in the desert, in the year of the closing of the last temple, when the last Egyptian priest shut the last cedar door of the last functioning sanctuary, and the long story, in some quiet but unmistakable way, was over. There is no urgency to any of this. Egypt itself was never in a hurry. Its time was the time of the river. Its calendar was the calendar of the flood. Decisions were made over generations. Buildings were built over generations. So you also do not need to hurry. You can let the names drift past. You can let the dates blur. You can fall asleep at any moment. The story will keep going, just as the river kept going, with or without anyone watching. It is the year 3050 before the birth of Christ. The reckoning, of course, has not yet been invented. The people who live along the river do not know they are at the beginning of anything. They know only that the river floods every summer, with the regularity of a heartbeat, and that the floods leave behind, on the long, narrow ribbon of land along its banks, a layer of fresh black silt, in which any planted seed will grow. This is the foundational fact of Egypt. The Nile, every summer, rises. It rises slowly through July and August, peaks in September, and recedes through the autumn. The water carries down, from the highlands of Ethiopia and the lakes of Central Africa, an enormous quantity of fine, mineral-rich sediment. When the water withdraws, the sediment remains. The fields, every autumn, are renewed. They do not need to be fertilized, they do not need to be rotated. They simply produce, year after year, century after century, millennium after millennium, with a fertility that has no real comparison anywhere else in the ancient world. As long as the flood continues, the people who live along this river will eat. The flood, though, is also a thin thing. The river itself is narrow. The valley it has cut, over millions of years, is narrow. On either side of the green ribbon of the floodplain, the desert begins almost immediately, hard and dry and yellow. From the air the country looks, even tonight, like a long green snake, winding through a vast yellow page. 9/10 of Egypt's land is uninhabitable. The inhabited country, the productive country, is a strip a few miles wide and 700 miles long. This shape, this geography, will determine almost everything about Egyptian civilization. It will produce, very early, the strong centralized state that the geography practically demands. Because the river floods all at once, the entire country has the same agricultural calendar, and someone has to coordinate the irrigation works and the grain storage. It will produce a civilization remarkably stable in its forms, because the boundaries of the inhabited country are so clearly drawn by the desert that there is, for most of 3,000 years, nowhere obvious for it to expand or fragment to. It will produce a religion, an art, an architecture, a writing system, a cuisine, all developed in a long, almost unbroken conversation with the same river, the same desert, the same patient cycle of rising and receding water. This is the country we are about to walk into. The story properly begins, as nearly as we can date it, around 3050 before the birth of Christ, when a king named Nama, ruling over the southern part of the river valley, the part that the Egyptians called Upper Egypt, somehow conquered or married or absorbed the northern part of the valley, the part the Egyptians called Lower Egypt, the broad delta where the river fans out into the Mediterranean. The unification produced, for the first time, a single political entity stretching from the southern frontier near modern Aswan to the Mediterranean coast. We call this the First Dynasty. Egyptian historiography itself, much later, called it the same thing. The early dynasties, the first, the second, are difficult for us to see in any detail. They ruled from a city called Memphis, just south of the apex of the delta. They produced beautifully decorated tombs. They were buried under low rectangular brick monuments called mastabas. The Arabic word means bench, and the buildings do, faintly, look like benches. Their kings carried by then the elaborate ceremonial regalia of Pharaonic Egypt. The double crown, white in front, red behind, joining the two halves of the country. The false beard, the crook and the flail. Their state was already organized. Their priests were already specialized. Their writing system was already in its essentials complete. But Egypt as we now imagine it, the Egypt of pyramids, of obelisks, of stone temples that look as though they have been there forever, really begins with the Third Dynasty. And, specifically, with one king and his architect. The king's name was Djoser. He ruled, by the best modern reconstruction, sometime around 2670 before the birth of Christ. We know almost nothing about him as a person. We do not know what he looked like exactly. We do not know what he thought about. We do not know how he came to the throne, or how he died. We know him almost entirely by what he built. His architect was a man named Imhotep, who is one of the very few non-royal individuals from the entire third millennium whose name we still know. Imhotep was, the much later sources tell us, a priest, a writer, an astronomer, a doctor. He is one of the first people in human history known to be remembered as an architect by name. The Egyptians themselves would, in later centuries, deify him. They would build him, in the early first millennium, his own temples. They would say that he could heal the sick, ease childbirth, bring rain. He may, very likely, have been the first commoner ever to be remembered, by his own civilization, as a god. What he built for Djoser was the first major piece of architecture made entirely of dressed stone in the human record. It still stands today, at a place called Saqqara, on the desert plateau just west of Memphis. It is a stepped pyramid, 6 rectangular tiers, rising in receding stages to a height of about 200 feet. It is not the first pyramid in any general sense. The Egyptians had been building tomb mounds for centuries, but it is the first to be made entirely of stone, the first to rise so high, the first to be designed as a deliberate piece of monumental architecture, rather than as the natural extension of an underground burial. Almost everything that follows in Egyptian monumental construction begins, in some sense, with this one building. The pyramids of the 4th dynasty, which followed Djoser by less than a century, are the ones the world has remembered. They were built by a small group of kings, Sneferu, his son Khufu, Khufu's sons Khafre and Menkaure, over perhaps 80 years, in the middle of the 26th and 25th centuries before Christ. They include the Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza, which is still, 4,500 years later, the largest stone building ever built by human hands. The Great Pyramid contains something close to 2.5 million blocks of limestone, each weighing on average 2.5 tons. Some of them, the granite blocks of the King's Chamber, weighing 80 tons or more. It rises to a height of about 475 feet. It was, until the Eiffel Tower in 1889, the tallest man-made structure on Earth. For more than 4,300 years, no one anywhere in the world built anything taller. How exactly the pyramids were built remains, in some particular details, contested, but the broad outlines have been clear for some time. They were built by enormous teams of organized workers, not slaves, contrary to a long popular tradition, but conscripted Egyptian peasants, paid in food and beer, working in coordinated rotating shifts during the months when the flood made farming impossible. They were quarried from local limestone for the bulk of the structure, and from finer white limestone at Tura, across the river for the casing. The finer granite of the inner chambers came from Aswan, 600 miles to the south, and was floated downriver on barges. The stones were dragged on wooden sledges over wet sand or wet wood, which is much less work than you might imagine. The whole thing was probably built in something like 20 years. We know this because there are cracks in the cement of one of the upper courses where, evidently, the work crews were rushing to finish before the king's anticipated death. What is harder to understand is not how but why. Why a society would commit, for generations, this enormous fraction of its national surplus to the construction of an enormous geometrical tomb for one man. The standard answer: that the Egyptians believed the dead king's spirit needed an enormous, permanent, perfectly aligned house in which to begin its journey to the next life, is correct in its outline, but does not really capture the strangeness of it. The Egyptians, alone among ancient civilizations, decided to expend a substantial portion of their wealth on the careful construction of single individual graves. They did this for centuries. They did this with techniques and resources that, in any other context, would have built cities or roads or fortifications or anything else. They did it, instead, for the dead. The pyramids are, in some real sense, the great Egyptian gesture toward eternity. They were meant to last forever. They have, so far, lasted 4,500 years. They will, very probably, last several thousand more. The Old Kingdom, as we now call this Great Pyramid Age, lasted about 500 years. Its later dynasties, the 5th and 6th, continued building pyramids, though none on the scale of Khufu's. They wrote, on the inner walls of those later pyramids, the long ceremonial poems we now call the pyramid texts, the oldest religious literature in the world, the first written prayers, the first written hymns to gods, the first written instructions for the soul of the dead king to find its way safely past the various dangers of the underworld. They governed with increasing administrative sophistication the long, narrow country along the river. They kept records. They built temples. They sent expeditions south into Nubia for gold, west into the desert oases for dates and salt, east across the Sinai for turquoise and copper, north into the Mediterranean for cedar from Lebanon. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the Old Kingdom began to come apart. We do not know exactly why. The classic explanation for many years was political. The gradual decentralization of authority, as the kings handed too much power to the regional governors, the nomarchs, who eventually became, in effect, hereditary local princes who no longer answered to the central court. There is some truth in this. The later 6th dynasty kings reigned for very long times, often extraordinarily long times. King Pepi II, by some traditions, reigned for 94 years, longer than any other monarch in human history before or since. And during such long reigns, with weakening central authority, regional lords inevitably accumulated power. But the better explanation, which has become clearer in recent decades through paleoclimate research, is environmental. Around 2200 before the birth of Christ, a sustained climate shift caused the Nile floods to fail, or to come weak, year after year, for several decades in a row. The agricultural foundation of the entire civilization wobbled. There are cryptic records from this period of famine, of grain prices rising astronomically, of regional governors writing about how they had personally fed their starving populations from their own granaries. There are sad late tomb inscriptions in which a man boasts that he, alone in his region, did not allow his people to die of hunger. The state, which existed primarily to coordinate the harvest, was undermined by the failure of the harvest. The Old Kingdom ended, more or less, around 2180 before the birth of Christ. What followed was about 150 years that the Egyptians themselves regarded in retrospect as a kind of dark age. We now call it the First Intermediate Period. The country fragmented into competing regional kingdoms. The north was ruled, briefly, from a city called Heracleopolis, in the Fayum region. The south was ruled from Thebes, 400 miles up the river, by an emerging dynasty of local princes. The two halves contested with each other, raided each other, made and broke alliances. It is in this period that we get one of the saddest pieces of literature in the entire Egyptian corpus. It is called The Lamentations of Ipuwer, an Egyptian sage. It describes, in a long and bitter prose poem, a country in which the social order has been overturned. The poor have become rich, and the rich have become poor. The river is no longer the river. The desert spreads where the green fields used to be. The dead are buried without ceremony. The temples are dark. The crocodiles are full. The country is in ruin. We do not know, exactly, when Ipuwer was written. We do not know whether Ipuwer was even a real person. But the poem captures, with a particular vividness, the felt experience of a civilization briefly losing its grip on its own continuity. The grip, however, returned. Around 2050 before the birth of Christ, a Theban prince named Mentuhotep II marched north out of the southern half of the country, defeated the rival kings of Heracleopolis, and reunified Egypt under a single throne for the first time in over a century. We now call this the founding of the Middle Kingdom. It would last in its own form about 350 years, through the 11th and 12th dynasties. The Middle Kingdom is, in some ways, the most attractive period in Egyptian history. It is less spectacular than the Old Kingdom or the New. It built no pyramids on the scale of Khufu's. It conquered no enormous foreign empires. But it produced, in its quiet way, some of the most beautiful art Egypt ever made. Its sculpture is more naturalistic, more restrained, more human, than the rigid hieratic forms of the Old Kingdom. Its literature, the tale of Sinuhe, the eloquent peasant, the story of the shipwrecked sailor, is the first body of imaginative prose fiction in human history, and is still being read, in modern English translations, on quiet evenings tonight. The Middle Kingdom kings rebuilt the central administration that had decayed during the First Intermediate Period. They reorganized the tax system. They strengthened the irrigation works. They expanded, for the first time in Egyptian history, beyond the natural boundaries of the country, into northern Nubia, beyond the First Cataract, building a series of enormous mud-brick fortresses to control the trade routes south. The fortresses are still there today, or rather, were until the construction of the Aswan High Dam in the 1960s, which flooded most of them under the new Lake Nasser. There are photographs of them, taken just before the flooding, that show enormous defensive structures in the sand, the same structures that had stood for almost 4,000 years, and that now lie under 60 feet of water. The greatest king of the 12th dynasty was a man named Senusret III, who ruled around the late 19th century before Christ. He was, by every account that survives, an unusually competent ruler. He centralized authority. He campaigned in Nubia. He extended the canal system. His statues are some of the most striking pieces of Egyptian portraiture. They show a heavy-jawed, somber-eyed man, lined with wrinkles, watching the camera with the resigned expression of someone who has been awake for too many years and knows exactly how much trouble his kingdom is going to be in 50 years after his death. He was not wrong. The 12th dynasty ended, around 1800 before Christ, in another period of weakening central authority. The 13th dynasty produced about 70 kings in 150 years. Most of them ruled for only a few years each, suggesting a court that could no longer keep its throne stable. The country drifted again into fragmentation. And this time, the fragmentation was complicated by a new phenomenon. A substantial population of foreign immigrants in the Eastern Delta, mostly Semitic-speaking, who had arrived during the previous century as merchants, mercenaries and settlers, and who, by the late 17th century before Christ, were powerful enough to constitute their own ruling dynasty in the north. The Egyptians called these foreign rulers the Hyksos, Hatshepsut, the rulers of foreign lands. We now call the period of their dominance the Second Intermediate Period. The Hyksos ruled most of northern Egypt for about 100 years, between roughly 1700 and 1600 before Christ. They were not, despite later Egyptian propaganda, a mass invasion of barbarian conquerors. They were, more accurately, the gradual political emergence of a Semitic-speaking population that had been living in the Eastern Delta for some generations already. They built their capital at a city called Avaris, in the Eastern Delta. They worshipped a mix of Egyptian and West Asian gods. They wrote in Egyptian. They ruled in many ways like Egyptian pharaohs. But the Egyptians, especially after their eventual expulsion, never forgave them. The Hyksos period was remembered, in later New Kingdom literature, as a great national humiliation. The time when Egypt, the eternal country, had been ruled by foreigners. The chief god of the Hyksos was called Set, an Egyptian deity associated with chaos and the desert. They were said to have desecrated the temples, slaughtered the children, persecuted the faithful. None of this is supported by archaeology. The Hyksos, on the evidence, ruled fairly competently. But the wound to the Egyptian self-image was real, and it shaped what came next. What came next was the New Kingdom, the third great age of Egyptian civilization, and the one most modern visitors think of when they think of Egypt. It began around 1550 before Christ, when a Theban prince, named Thutmose I, marched north, fought a long sequence of campaigns against the Hyksos, took their capital at Avaris, drove their remnants out of Egypt, and into southwestern Palestine, and reunified the country under Theban rule. The Egyptians, however, had learned a lesson. Foreign powers, the Hyksos episode had taught them, could no longer simply be ignored. Egypt could not, any longer, treat its frontiers as the natural boundaries of the world. To prevent another Hyksos, the Egyptians would have to project their power outward, into Palestine, into Syria, into Nubia. They would have to become, for the first time in their long history, an empire. The New Kingdom lasted about 500 years, from 1550 to 1070 before Christ, through the 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties. It produced more famous individual kings than any other period of Egyptian history: Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, Seti I, Ramesses II. Names known, even tonight, to people who could not name a single king of the Old or Middle Kingdoms. They built bigger temples, conducted larger campaigns, and left more durable propaganda than any previous Egyptian rulers. The buildings most modern visitors associate with Egypt: the great hypostyle hall at Karnak, the temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahri, the four colossi of Ramesses II at Abu Simbel, the painted tombs of the Valley of the Kings, are almost all New Kingdom. The most extraordinary of the early New Kingdom rulers was a woman. She was Hatshepsut, the daughter of Thutmose I, the wife and half-sister of Thutmose II, and after her husband's death, the regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III. She was supposed by every Egyptian tradition to step down when the boy came of age. Instead, after a few years of regency, she had herself declared pharaoh. Not queen regent, not consort. Pharaoh, in the full ceremonial sense, with the false beard and the double crown, and the ritual fiction that she was the male son of the god Amun. She ruled for about 22 years. Her reign was, by every measurable standard, prosperous. She built one of the most beautiful temples in Egypt, at a place called Deir el-Bahri, in a curved cliff face on the west bank of the Nile across from Thebes. The temple is still there. It is one of the most architecturally inventive buildings of the ancient world, terraced, colonnaded, carved into the living rock of the cliff behind it. She sent a famous trading expedition to a country called Punt, somewhere on the Red Sea coast, possibly modern Eritrea, and brought back myrrh trees, ivory, ebony, gold, and trained baboons. The reliefs of this expedition, on the walls of Deir el-Bahri, are some of the most charming pieces of art ever produced in the ancient world. When Hatshepsut died of natural causes by every available indication, her stepson Thutmose III took sole rule. He was by then about 30 years old, an experienced general, deeply formed by 20 years of training under his stepmother's regime. He waited, however, for some 22 years after his accession before he ordered the systematic destruction of his stepmother's images and the careful chiseling away of her name from her monuments. We do not know with any certainty why. The traditional explanation is jealousy or political concerns about female rule, but neither holds up well under modern scrutiny. Thutmose III had, by then, ruled for 20 years on his own, and he carefully preserved many of Hatshepsut's buildings, including her great temple. The defacement may have been simply a late attempt, near the end of his reign, to retroactively normalize the dynastic succession from Thutmose II directly to Thutmose III, eliminating the female interregnum from the formal record. Whatever his motives, the defacement was incomplete. Hatshepsut survived in the archaeological record. Her statues, broken and scattered, were reassembled by archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries. We know who she was, we know what she built, we know what she did. The ancient project of forgetting her did not, in the end, succeed. Thutmose III himself, in the second half of his reign, conducted 17 military campaigns into Palestine, Syria, and Nubia. He pushed the Egyptian empire to its largest ever extent. By the time he was finished, Egyptian forces were operating as far north as the Euphrates, where Thutmose III erected a stela, a stone monument, claiming the river as the northern boundary of his empire. The Egyptians had, for the first time in their history, a tributary network of vassal kingdoms in Asia. The wealth that flowed back from this empire, gold from Nubia, cedar from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, slaves from everywhere, funded the most extravagant building program any pharaoh had yet attempted. The peak of the early New Kingdom, in some ways, was the reign of Thutmose III's great-grandson, Amenhotep III. He ruled for about 38 years, from 1391 to 1353 before Christ. His reign was almost entirely peaceful. He inherited an empire so dominant that no neighbor was willing to challenge it. He spent his decades not on warfare, but on building, diplomacy, marriage. He built the Temple of Luxor on the east bank at Thebes. He built his enormous mortuary complex on the west bank, fronted by the two famous colossi of Memnon, 60-foot-high seated statues of himself, which are, even tonight, in their wind-eroded ruin, two of the most striking pieces of late ancient sculpture standing in the world. He maintained an extensive correspondence with the other great kings of the ancient Near East, the Hittite king, the kings of Mitanni, and Babylon and Assyria, preserved for us in a famous archive of clay tablets called the Amarna letters. Amenhotep III ruled at the absolute peak of Egyptian imperial power. He was by some accounts the wealthiest single individual the ancient world ever produced. And then he died, in 1353, leaving the throne to his son. The son's name was Akhenaten, and what he was about to do would, for 16 years, attempt to overthrow the entire religious foundation of Egyptian civilization. The reign of Akhenaten is the strangest single episode in Egyptian history. It lasted only 16 years, from 1353 to 1336 before Christ. By the time it was over, almost everything Akhenaten had attempted to do had been undone. His religious revolution had been reversed. His city had been abandoned. His name had been chiseled off his monuments. He himself, by the time of Tutankhamun's reign a generation later, was being officially referred to in inscriptions as that enemy from Akhenaten, his name unspeakable. He was meant by the deliberate act of his successors to be forgotten. He was, for 32 centuries, almost successfully forgotten. It was only in the late 19th century, when archaeologists began to systematically excavate the abandoned site of his desert capital, that the basic outlines of his reign began to emerge. He has, in the centuries since, become one of the most discussed and most contested figures in all of Egyptian history. What he did was this. Within 5 years of his accession, he began to suppress the worship of Egypt's traditional gods. He shut down the temples. He confiscated the temple lands. He had the names of the old gods chiseled off existing monuments. And he proclaimed in their place the worship of a single god, the Aten, the visible disk of the sun, who was, in Akhenaten's theology, the only true God, the source of all life, the universal creator. Akhenaten, alone among Egyptians, was the Aten's high priest, the Aten's son, the Aten's only authorized intermediary on earth. The Aten communicated with humanity only through Akhenaten. To worship the Aten correctly, in any other manner, was impossible. This is, by some traditional readings, the first monotheism in human history. Whether that reading is exactly right, is contested. Akhenaten's Aten retained many features of the older Egyptian sun cult, and the king himself was still, in some sense, divinized within the system. But the impulse, the sweeping rejection of polytheism in favor of a single creator god, was unmistakable. It would not be matched, in the surrounding ancient world, for another 5 centuries, when the religion of Israel began to develop its own monotheistic traditions in a different form. He moved, in the 5th year of his reign, his entire capital from Thebes to a brand new city he ordered, built in the middle of the desert, halfway between Thebes and Memphis, at a location with no previous history of habitation. He called the new city Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten. It was constructed from scratch in something like 5 years by tens of thousands of conscripted workers. It had palaces, temples, residential quarters, administrative buildings, It had no walls, it had no cult sites for any traditional god. It existed, the first city in human history of which this is true, for a single religious purpose, defined by a single individual, in the service of a single deity. He also revolutionized Egyptian art. The traditional Egyptian artistic style had remained, for nearly 1500 years, almost unchanged in its formal conventions. Figures in profile, hands and feet sideways, eyes and shoulders shown frontally. Under Akhenaten, this convention shattered. The new royal portraits show the king with elongated face, narrow eyes, full lips, distended belly, wide hips, almost feminine proportions. They show his queen, the famous Nefertiti, with similar characteristics. They show his daughters, with lengthened skulls. They show, in a series of remarkable family portraits, the king and queen affectionately embracing their daughters. Domestic intimacy of a kind that had never been depicted in Egyptian official art before. We do not know why the artistic style changed so radically. The most obvious explanation, that the royal family actually looked that way, has had its supporters and detractors. The king's mummy, when finally identified by genetic testing in the early 21st century, showed some unusual features, but not necessarily the extreme ones depicted in his art. The likeliest explanation current scholars tend to think is that the new style was, like the new theology, a deliberate attempt to break with the old. The king, having broken with the old gods, broke with the old artistic conventions for representing the sacred at the same time. Akhenaten died, of unknown causes, around 1336 before Christ. Within 5 years of his death, the experiment was over. His own son or stepson, a child king known to history as Tutankhamun, ascended the throne, abandoned Akhenaten, returned to Thebes, restored the temples of the old gods, and began, with the help of his powerful regents, the systematic erasure of Akhenaten's reign from official history. The Aten was no longer worshipped, the traditional gods were restored, the names of Akhenaten and his successors were left out of subsequent king lists. The city of Akhenaten was abandoned. The bricks were carted off and reused elsewhere. By the time Ramesses II ruled, almost a century later, the location of Akhenaten was no longer common knowledge. The whole strange episode disappeared into the desert. Tutankhamun himself, the boy king, who ended his father's experiment, ruled for 9 more years, and died at about 19 years old, of unclear causes. He has become, almost certainly, the most famous Egyptian king tonight, known to almost everyone, simply because his small intact tomb in the Valley of the Kings was the only royal tomb of the New Kingdom that remained essentially undisturbed by ancient grave robbers, and was therefore the only such tomb to be excavated in modern times in something like its original state. The tomb, found by Howard Carter in 1922, was filled with 5,000 objects, chariots, thrones, jewelry, mummified pets, golden masks. The most famous of those objects, the solid gold burial mask of the king, is, even tonight, perhaps the single most recognized artifact from any ancient civilization. But Tutankhamun, considered as a king, was a minor figure. The reign that mattered, in the next generation of Egyptian power, was the reign of his great-grandson's great-grandson, a man named Ramesses II, who came to the throne about 50 years after Tutankhamun's death, who ruled for 66 years, who fathered, by various wives, perhaps 100 children, and who became, in his own time and ever after, the very model of a great Egyptian king. Ramesses II ruled from 1279 to 1213 before Christ. In those 66 years he built more temples, fathered more children, fought more battles, and erected more colossal statues of himself than any other Egyptian king in history. He fought the famous Battle of Kadesh against the Hittite Empire in the 5th year of his reign. The battle, in actual military terms, was a draw. Neither side won decisively, and neither side could budge the other from the strategic balance in northern Syria. Ramesses, however, returned home and proceeded to declare on every available temple wall, for the next half-century, that he had won an enormous and decisive victory. The Battle of Kadesh is, in some ways, the most consequential historical event in Egyptian propaganda history. It is the event Ramesses II commemorated more thoroughly than any other in his long reign. We have multiple Egyptian accounts. We have also the actual Hittite account, recorded on a clay tablet found at the Hittite capital of Hattusa in the early 20th century. The two versions, when read side by side, agree on almost no important point. Each side describes itself as the clear winner. This is the first historical event in human history for which we have detailed accounts from both opposing sides, and it is, perhaps fittingly, an event in which both sides came home and lied about what had happened. 16 years after Kadesh, the Egyptians and the Hittites signed a formal peace treaty. It is the oldest peace treaty in human history of which we have the actual text. We have copies in both Egyptian, on temple walls at Karnak, and in Hittite cuneiform, on clay tablets from Hattusa. The Egyptian and Hittite versions, this time, do agree with each other on most points. The treaty established a defensive alliance, mutual extradition of fugitives, and a recognized boundary in northern Syria that both sides would respect. It held, more or less, for as long as both kingdoms existed. Ramesses II's reign was the long, prosperous late afternoon of Egyptian imperial power. He built obsessively. He extended the great hypostyle hall at Karnak. He built two enormous rock-cut temples at Abu Simbel in Nubia, fronted by 4 60-foot seated statues of himself. He built a new capital city in the eastern delta, called Pi Ramesses, of which almost nothing now survives above ground. He built monuments at Memphis, at Heliopolis, at Thebes, at Luxor, at every major site in Egypt. He had himself depicted, sometimes by simply reinscribing his own name on existing earlier statues belonging to predecessor kings, on more surfaces than perhaps any other ruler in human history. When he finally died, in his early 90s, in 1213 before Christ, more than half of his subjects had been born after the start of his reign. Most of them had never known any other king. The transition to his successor, Merneptah, was awkward. Merneptah was already in his early 60s when he came to the throne. His own reign was difficult, marked by famine, by a major Libyan invasion of the western delta, and by the first signs of the great wave of crisis that was about to engulf the entire late Bronze Age world. Sometime around 1200 before Christ, the entire interconnected civilization of the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean came apart. We do not, even now, fully understand why, but we know, with reasonable certainty, what happened. The Hittite Empire, in central Anatolia, collapsed completely. Its capital at Hattusa was burned. Its records stop. Its population disperses into smaller, less organized successor groups. The Mycenaean civilization in mainland Greece collapsed. The great palaces of Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, Knossos, are burned and abandoned. Greek literacy, the Linear B writing system used to keep palace records, is forgotten. Greeks would not be literate again for almost 400 years. The city-states of the Levantine coast, Ugarit, Byblos, Sidon, are destroyed or substantially weakened. Cypriot copper exports collapse. International trade routes that had functioned for centuries simply stop. In Egypt, the disaster does not destroy the state, but it severely weakens it. Egypt is attacked around 1200 before Christ by what the Egyptian sources call the Sea Peoples, a confederation of unknown groups, possibly displaced populations from the Aegean and the western Anatolian coast, who arrived by sea and overland in enormous numbers, swept the entire eastern Mediterranean clean of organized opposition, and finally encountered, on the coast of the Nile Delta, the still formidable Egyptian army. Ramesses III, the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom, fought a major series of campaigns against the Sea Peoples in the years around 1275. He won, more or less. He drove off the seaborne invasions, he stabilized the eastern frontier, he built one of the most beautiful temples in Egypt at Medinet Habu, on the west bank of the Nile, decorated with elaborate reliefs depicting his victories over the Sea Peoples. The temple is still there. The reliefs, even tonight, in their late afternoon shadow, are the principal historical record we have of the late Bronze Age catastrophe. But the cost of this victory was enormous. Egypt's empire in Asia, the empire built by Thutmose III, was lost. The grain tribute from Palestine and Syria stopped. The international trade network that had supplied Egypt with cedar, with copper, with tin, with luxury goods for half a millennium, was gone. Egypt, after Ramesses III, retreated, slowly, into a smaller and poorer version of itself. Ramesses III himself was assassinated, around 1155 before Christ, in a complicated palace conspiracy involving one of his secondary wives and her son. He was the last pharaoh of any real consequence in the New Kingdom. His successors, the long and increasingly weak series of Ramessides who followed him, presided over a slow decline that lasted almost a century. The state ran out of gold. The temples ran out of grain. The royal tomb workers at Deir el-Medina on the west bank of the Nile went on strike, repeatedly, because their wages were not paid. We have, from this period, the actual records of those strikes. The first documented labor strike in human history, around 1170 before Christ. The New Kingdom ended, more or less, in 1070 before Christ, when the last Ramesside pharaoh was politely deposed by his own high priest of Amun, who had effectively been running the country for a generation already. What followed, for the next 400 years, was a period of fragmentation and foreign rule that the Egyptians themselves regarded as a long, unhappy dimming of their civilization. We now call it the Third Intermediate Period. For roughly the next 1,000 years, between the end of the New Kingdom and the conquest of Alexander, Egypt was ruled by a succession of dynasties, most of which were either weak, foreign, or both. The 21st dynasty, ruling from the delta city of Tanis, was Egyptian by ethnicity but governed, in practice, only the northern half of the country. The 22nd dynasty, beginning around 945 before Christ, was Libyan in origin, descendants of Libyan mercenaries who had settled in Egypt during the late New Kingdom. The 25th dynasty, beginning around 747 before Christ, was Nubian black African pharaohs from the Kingdom of Kush in modern Sudan, who marched north and conquered Egypt for a brief but distinguished century, reuniting the country under foreign rule and patronizing a kind of self-conscious archaizing revival of Old Kingdom artistic styles. The Nubians were driven out, around 664 before Christ, by the Assyrians, who briefly conquered Egypt themselves. The Assyrians, unable to hold their distant Egyptian conquest, withdrew within a generation. The native 26th dynasty, ruling from the delta city of Sais, briefly restored Egyptian independence. Then, in 525 before Christ, the Persians, under Cambyses II, the son of Cyrus the Great, conquered Egypt and absorbed it into the rapidly expanding Achaemenid Empire. Egypt was a Persian satrapy for the next century. There were occasional revolts, brief periods of independence, but for most of the 5th century before Christ, the country was governed from far-off Persepolis. The Greeks, by then rising as the major Mediterranean power across the sea, found the Persian Empire's grip on Egypt to be one of the great geopolitical facts of their world, and many of them, Herodotus most famously, traveled to Persian-ruled Egypt and wrote about what they found there. What they found was a country still, recognizably, the Egypt of the pharaohs, with the same temples, the same religion, the same priesthood, the same hieroglyphic writing system, but the political surface had been overlaid by a foreign empire, and the wealth of the country was being extracted, increasingly, to support that empire's other concerns. The Persian rule of Egypt was interrupted, in the early 4th century, by a final native dynasty, the 28th, 29th, and 30th dynasties, which managed, between 404 and 343 before Christ, to expel the Persians and rule independently for about 60 years. It was the last period of native Egyptian rule. The last pharaoh of native birth, Nectanebo II, was driven out by a final Persian reconquest in 343. He fled south into Nubia and disappeared from the historical record. But the second Persian conquest of Egypt lasted only a decade. In 332 before Christ, a young Macedonian king named Alexander, having defeated the main Persian field army at the Battle of Hyksos the previous year, marched south, through Palestine and into Egypt. The Egyptian population, after a decade of Persian misrule, welcomed him as a liberator. The Persian satraps surrendered without a fight. Alexander entered Memphis, was crowned pharaoh in the Egyptian manner, founded a new city on the Mediterranean coast at the western edge of the delta, naming it modestly Alexandria, and then, after a winter in the country, marched east to continue his pursuit of the Persian Empire. He never returned to Egypt during his life. When he died in 323 before Christ, in a Babylonian palace, his enormous empire was carved up among his generals. The general who took Egypt was an old companion of Alexander's named Ptolemy. Ptolemy, after some careful maneuvering, declared himself pharaoh in 305 before Christ, founding a Macedonian Greek dynasty that would rule Egypt for the next 270 years. We now call this the Ptolemaic dynasty. It is the last Egyptian dynasty. It produced, among many other rulers, the most famous pharaoh in the popular Western imagination after Tutankhamun. She is the queen who stands, even tonight, at the symbolic end of 3,000 years of Egyptian history. Her name was Cleopatra. Cleopatra was, more precisely, Cleopatra VII Philopator. There had been 6 Cleopatras before her in the Ptolemaic dynasty. She was, however, by such a margin the most consequential of them that history has, by simple shorthand, used the name to refer to her alone. She was born, in 69 before Christ, into a royal family that had become by then, almost grotesquely dysfunctional. The Ptolemies, like many ancient royal houses, had practiced sibling marriage for generations, to keep the bloodline pure. The result, after 2 centuries of brother-sister unions, was a royal lineage that was politically poisonous and personally unstable. Cleopatra's grandfather had murdered his brother. Her father, Ptolemy XII, had been driven out of Egypt twice by his own population, and restored each time by the Romans. Her older sister had been executed for trying to depose their father. Cleopatra inherited, at the age of 18 in 51 before Christ, a country deeply in debt to Rome, surrounded by political enemies, and ruled jointly with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, whom she was supposed to marry and govern alongside. The arrangement broke down within 2 years. By 48 before Christ, Cleopatra had been driven out of Alexandria by her brother's faction and was raising an army in eastern Egypt to retake her throne. The civil war in Egypt was settled, almost incidentally, by the much larger civil war then convulsing the Roman Republic. Julius Caesar, having defeated his rival Pompey at the Battle of Pharsalus, pursued his fleeing enemy to Egypt, where Pompey was promptly murdered on a beach by Ptolemy XIII's officials, in the unfortunate hope that Caesar would be grateful. Caesar, when presented with Pompey's severed head, wept. He was Pompey's son-in-law, his old friend, his old colleague. He took Alexandria, executed the courtiers who had ordered Pompey's murder, and decided to settle the Egyptian succession himself. Cleopatra, by then 21 years old, smuggled herself into Alexandria, possibly, the famous later story claims, rolled inside a carpet, and presented herself to Caesar in his quarters. Caesar, who was in his early 50s, found her by every account captivating. They became lovers within a few days. He restored her to the throne, alongside her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, who would, in due course, also be murdered, possibly by Cleopatra herself, and stayed in Egypt for nearly a year of leisure. Cleopatra bore Caesar a son, Caesarion, in the summer of 47. When Caesar returned to Rome, Cleopatra eventually followed, accompanied by Caesarion, and lived, for about a year, in a villa across the Tiber from Rome that Caesar had given her. She was there in March of 44 before Christ, when Caesar was assassinated on the floor of the Senate. She returned, immediately, to Egypt. The next 13 years of her life are some of the most consequential 13 years in late Republican history. Caesar's assassination produced a complicated, multi-sided civil war among his various heirs and assassins. The two main heirs, Octavian and Mark Antony, divided the Roman world between them, Octavian taking the west and Antony the east. Antony's portfolio, naturally, included Egypt, the wealthiest province of the Roman world, the source of grain for the city of Rome, ruled by a young queen who had been Caesar's lover, and who controlled, in her son, a possible alternative claim to Caesar's political legacy. Antony and Cleopatra met, in 41 before Christ, in Tarsus, on the Cilician coast. They became lovers, and over the next several years, increasingly political partners. Antony divorced his Roman wife, Octavian's sister Octavia, and married Cleopatra in an Egyptian ceremony. He recognized her son Caesarion as Caesar's legitimate heir. He gave her, in a series of formal donations, large parts of the Eastern Roman world to govern as her own. This was, in Roman political terms, a fatal error. Octavian, the master of Roman public opinion, used the donations of Antony to Cleopatra to portray Antony as a man who had abandoned Rome itself, who had handed the Roman East over to a foreign queen, who intended, possibly, to move the seat of the Roman world to Alexandria. The propaganda worked. Octavian declared war on Cleopatra in 32 before Christ. He defeated the combined Antonian and Egyptian fleet at the Battle of Actium in 31 before Christ. Antony and Cleopatra fled back to Egypt. When Octavian's army arrived outside Alexandria in the late summer of 30 before Christ, Antony, falsely informed that Cleopatra had killed herself, fell on his sword in the manner expected of a defeated Roman general. He died in his lover's arms, dragged up by ropes into the upper story of the mausoleum where she had taken refuge. Cleopatra, after some attempts to negotiate with Octavian, took her own life. By the famous tradition, an asp smuggled in a basket of figs, on the 12th of August of that year. She was 39 years old. Her son Caesarion, the last Ptolemaic pharaoh of Egypt, was killed by Octavian's order shortly afterward. He was 17. With his death, 3,000 years of pharaonic Egypt formally ended. The country that Octavian, soon to be the Emperor Augustus, annexed in 30 before Christ was, for all its political subjugation, still recognizably Egypt. The temples of Isis and Osiris and Amun and Ptah were still functioning. The hieroglyphic writing system was still being used by the priesthood. The Coptic-speaking population still farmed the same fields, in the same way, by the same calendar. The Nile still flooded every summer. Egypt under the Romans was, for the first 3 centuries, a quiet, prosperous, somewhat depopulated province. Augustus governed it as his personal estate, refusing even to allow Roman senators to visit it without imperial permission, on the grounds that whoever controlled Egypt could starve Rome by stopping the grain ships. The Roman administration of Egypt was, by ancient standards, efficient and stable. The temples continued to operate. New temples were even built, in the old style, with the names of Roman emperors inscribed in cartouches in the manner of old pharaohs. There is something almost touching about the late Egyptian temple of Dendera, with its elaborate astronomical ceiling, its goddess Hathor suckling the infant Horus on every column, and a small relief on a side wall showing the Roman Emperor Claudius, wearing a kilt and a false beard, making sacrifice in the Egyptian manner. The change came slowly, with the conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity. By the 4th century, Egyptian Christianity had become one of the most fervent and disciplined branches of the early church. The Egyptian deserts were full of monks, solitary anchorites in caves, communities of cenobites in early monasteries, the great theologians of the Alexandrian school. Christianity displaced the older religion, sometimes violently, sometimes simply by attrition. The temples, deprived of their state funding under successively more Christian emperors, slowly ceased to function. The priests, no longer paid, drifted away. The hieroglyphic writing system, which had lasted 3,000 years, gradually ceased to be used. The last known hieroglyphic inscription anywhere in Egypt was carved at the Temple of Isis on the island of Philae, near the southern frontier, in the year 394 after Christ. It is a small, badly cut graffito, made by a priest named Esmet Akom, on the birthday of the goddess. It is, in its quiet way, the end of a continuous written tradition that had begun at the dawn of Egyptian civilization, 3,400 years earlier. After 394, no one in the world wrote in hieroglyphs again. The script would remain unread for almost 1,500 years, until the French scholar Jean-François Champollion, working from the Rosetta Stone, finally deciphered it in 1822. The Temple of Isis at Philae, the last working pharaonic temple in the world, was forcibly closed by the Christian Emperor Justinian in the year 537 of our era. Coincidentally, the same year Justinian completed the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. The same year that the Byzantine story we followed in another evening's broadcast reached its high beginning, the Egyptian story reached its quiet ending. The cult statues were removed. The priests were exiled. The temple buildings were eventually converted into Christian churches. The 1,000-year continuity, finally, broke. A century later, in the year 642 of our era, an Arab army, under the general Amr ibn al-As, marching west out of recently converted Arabia, conquered Roman Egypt in a brief campaign. The country, after 1,600 years of Greco-Roman administration, became Muslim and Arabic-speaking. The Coptic Christians, the descendants of the older Egyptian population, became, slowly over many centuries, a minority in their own country, though they still survive today, 10 million strong, the last linear descendants of the people who built the pyramids. The country that emerged from these long transformations was no longer ancient Egypt, it was something new. Arabic-speaking, Muslim, connected, in new ways, to the wider Islamic world. The pyramids were still there. The temples were still there, half buried in sand, their gods forgotten, their inscriptions unreadable. The Nile still flooded every summer. But the people who lived along the river no longer thought of the river the same way. The names of the old gods were no longer spoken. The hieroglyphs on the walls of Karnak and Abu Simbel were, to the people who walked past them every day, decorative scribbles in a forgotten script. It would take, as we said, 15 centuries for the script to be read again. It would take the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt in 1798, the discovery of the Rosetta Stone the next year by a French engineering officer, and the patient labor of Champollion through the 1810s and 1820s, before the inscriptions on the walls of the great temples could once again be understood by any living human being. It would take the rise of modern Egyptology as a scholarly discipline, the systematic excavation of the Valley of the Kings, the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, the long, careful reconstruction of the dynastic chronologies, before the broad shape of 3,000 years of pharaonic history could begin to be reassembled. The reassembly is still going on, new discoveries are still being made. New tombs are still being opened, in the Valley of the Kings, in the sands of Saqqara, in the desert outside Cairo. The civilization that ended, in some essential sense, with the closing of the temple at Philae, is still, even tonight, slowly being remembered. We have come to the end of our story. It has been the longest walk we have ever taken in these long evenings. We began, 3,000 years ago by our reckoning, on a quiet morning along a river in northeastern Africa. We have followed since then, the rise of the first centralized state, the building of the Great Pyramids, the long dimming of the First Intermediate Period, the recovery of the Middle Kingdom, the foreign Hyksos rule, the imperial expansion of the New Kingdom, the strange Atenist experiment of Akhenaten, the long afternoon of Ramesses II, the Bronze Age catastrophe, the long centuries of foreign rule, the conquest of Alexander, the dynasty of the Ptolemies, the death of Cleopatra, the long Roman quiet, the slow Christianization, the closing of the temples, the Arab conquest, It is the longest continuous story any single human civilization has ever produced, and it ended, in its essential pharaonic form, 1,500 years ago. But of course, in another sense, it did not end. The pyramids are still there, the Sphinx is still there. The hieroglyphs on the walls of Karnak are, again, readable. The mummies in the museums of Cairo and Luxor and London and Berlin have been carefully studied and, in many cases, restored to dignity. The Coptic liturgy, sung every Sunday in churches across modern Egypt, is the direct linguistic descendant of the language Cleopatra spoke. The grain that fed Rome still grows in the same fields, on the same flooded soil, by the same patient river. The Nile, every summer, still rises. We are at the end now. Take a moment, if you are still awake, to soften your shoulders, to unclench your jaw, to let the day again go. If you are not still awake, that perhaps is the better outcome. We did not promise you a history, we promised you a sleep. The history was simply the carriage in which the sleep arrived. In a moment this will end, there will be silence, the music will fade. Then, in another moment, this will begin again, for the next listener, somewhere else, in another quiet evening. The history, like the river, does not end. It only continues, in some other room. We are very glad you came, we are very glad you stayed, we hope you sleep deeply, and well. Good night, from the Drowsy Historian.